Something curious happens when a government borrows money. The moment of borrowing looks ordinary, but the obligation that follows never quite disappears. Debt begins as a tool. It lets a government spend today on things that take years to build: roads, bridges, schools, infrastructure of all kinds. The logic seems reasonable. Borrow now, repay later. A growing economy generates more revenue. That future revenue covers the original cost comfortably. But here is what makes this interesting. The repayment assumption depends entirely on conditions. Growth must continue. Rates must stay low. Revenue must arrive. When governments borrow, they issue bonds. A bond is a very specific promise. Pay interest every year. Return the full principal at a fixed future date. Interest is the price of borrowing. It leaves the Treasury every single year. It does not matter whether the economy is performing well or struggling. That is worth pausing on. The obligation does not pause. It does not wait for elections. It does not respond to a new administration's preferences or promises. Governments rarely repay their debt outright. Instead, they roll it over. Old bonds mature, and new bonds immediately replace them, perpetuating the obligation forward. Rolling over debt is not the same as paying it. The principal stays. Only the clock resets. The weight carried forward does not shrink at all. Each rollover happens at whatever interest rate the market offers that particular day. When rates rise, the same debt becomes measurably more expensive to carry. This is called refinancing risk. A country becomes dependent on the market's willingness to keep lending, and that willingness is not guaranteed in advance. Debt also accumulates through annual deficits. Whenever spending exceeds revenue in a given year, the gap must be covered by borrowing additional funds. Each new deficit adds to the total stock of outstanding debt. The pile grows year by year, even when each individual deficit looks relatively small and manageable. Economists typically measure debt against the size of the economy itself. This ratio tells you how heavy the burden is relative to the capacity to carry it. A high debt level can be sustained if the economy grows faster than its interest costs. Economists call this condition the primary surplus requirement for stability. But when growth slows and interest rates rise at the same time, that balance tips. The debt burden starts growing faster than the capacity to service it. At this point, something structural has changed. A government must now borrow just to cover the interest on what it already owes. The principal is untouched entirely. This pattern has a name: a debt spiral. Revenue pays interest. New borrowing replaces maturing debt. The principal never actually shrinks. It only circulates endlessly. Some argue that sovereign debt is fundamentally different from household debt. A country does not die. It can always issue more currency. But that logic has real limits. Printing currency to cover debt reduces the value of every unit in circulation. Creditors receive repayment in full, but the real value delivered is considerably lower. Creditors are not passive participants in this process. When they sense risk building, they demand higher yields. The cost of new borrowing rises in response immediately. Bond yields and bond prices move in opposite directions. When market confidence drops, yields spike upward instantly. The cost of the same debt changes without any new borrowing. What is curious here is that this channel examines how mechanisms like this one compound across time in different institutions. Subscribing surfaces those patterns as they emerge. Countries that borrow in their own currency have more flexibility. Countries that borrow in a foreign currency face a much harder constraint when conditions shift against them. Foreign currency debt is particularly unforgiving. If the domestic currency weakens, the debt grows larger in local terms without any additional borrowing having occurred. This amplification effect has collapsed government budgets before. The debt itself does not grow. The measuring unit shrinks. The result is mathematically identical either way. Austerity is one well-known response. Cut spending, raise taxes, generate a surplus. Then direct that surplus toward reducing the outstanding principal over several years. But austerity reduces demand inside the economy at the same time. Growth slows. Tax revenues fall. The surplus becomes harder to sustain than original projections suggested. This is the austerity paradox. The action taken to shrink the debt ratio can, under specific conditions, make the ratio worse before any improvement becomes visible at all. Debt restructuring is a second path. Creditors accept reduced payments or extended timelines. But the reputational cost of restructuring closes future credit access for many years. Default is the final available option. It stops the outflow immediately, but it freezes the credit channel entirely. A defaulting country enters a new and substantially harder constraint set. The most common historical path is simply to grow out of debt. A fast-growing economy makes the debt ratio fall over time without requiring any direct principal reduction. Post-war economies showed exactly this. Wartime debt was enormous by any measure, but decades of sustained growth caused the ratio to fall without deliberate repayment effort. But growth cannot be commanded into existence. It depends on productivity, investment, demographics, and external conditions. None of these factors are guaranteed or permanent. When growth stalls and rates rise simultaneously, the dynamic shifts very fast. The primary balance needed to stabilize the ratio becomes politically difficult to maintain at all. Aging populations add another compounding layer. As the workforce shrinks relative to retirees, tax revenue per person falls, while social spending per person rises structurally. These demographic pressures are long dated and known in advance. They are modeled decades ahead, and they compound the existing debt without requiring any new political decision. Political cycles create their own gravitational pull. Short election horizons favor spending today. Long-term costs fall on administrations and taxpayers not yet in any position of authority. Debt, therefore, persists across entire generations. Each new administration inherits the full obligations of those before it. The starting position is almost never anywhere near zero. A new administration can choose to honor the debt, restructure it, or gradually inflate it away. Each path carries a real cost. None of the available options are consequence-free. What is curious about all of this is the consistency. Every path involves a transfer. Every era faces the same structural problem. The obligation always finds a new bearer eventually. The system continues, quietly and without interruption. Interest flows out. New bonds replace old ones. The cycle carries itself forward, sustained entirely by its own structure.